Greetings, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture. My name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist who integrates my training in psychology and scripture studies to help better understand the Gospels from a different perspective and focus on new pastoral teachings for Christians. The Gospels are a rich source of learning about God and developing our spirituality. We are far from exhausting the learning potential. My podcasts are between 7 to 10 minutes in length, where I share insights and reflections that I hope will be useful to you. Please don't hesitate to contact me with questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you. Today's podcast is from Mark chapter 10, verse 46 to 52. This gospel will be read in churches October 27th, 2024. Today's podcast describes the healing of a blind man by Jesus. Before we go into the gospel, I want to point out that miracles were likely problematic for Jesus. Although he wanted to help those in need, some people may have been attracted to him because they witnessed a miracle rather than by the words he spoke. Also, the crowds following Jesus might be more motivated by a desire to witness a miracle rather than be inspired by what Jesus was trying to teach them. In the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 26, Jesus calls the people out, questioning their true intention for following him, where he says, "Very truly I tell you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." So miracles speak of Jesus' love for his people. The teaching from the miracle may be not as evident as we would like, but it's important to pay attention to the circumstances surrounding the miracle to give us insight into the lesson. Mark goes into a fair amount of detail in the gospel we are reflecting on today. For example, we know the blind man's name, Bartimaeus, and that his father's name was Timaeus. Most healing miracles do not have much information about the situation. Often we don't know their name and can only make an educated guess as to their life situation. I've come to realize that often the details are remembered because the details may have some teaching value. Bartimaeus was blind and so had to resort to begging to feed himself. As a beggar, he had to compete with other beggars in order to survive. His life was undoubtedly harsh. We do not know if he had any support from his family. The mention of his father Timaeus suggests that he may have had some family support. Likely, outside support was sparse at best. Probably, he learned to be pushy to get what he needed. We can see his assertiveness in the gospel reading. He is not going to be stopped by a bunch of people who didn't like him, yelling and creating a scene. His assertiveness pays off, and he is invited to speak to Jesus. He doesn't need to be asked twice. He had heard about Jesus and believed that Jesus could help him. I can imagine him stumbling and trying to reach and find Jesus. He has been given an opportunity, and he is going to use it to the fullest. What I find bizarre is the question that Jesus puts to the man. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus, who could figure out what the Pharisees were thinking, is now asking a blind man what he wants. It would be obvious to anyone the man was blind and he wanted to be healed of his blindness. Usually, though, when Jesus asks a question, he already knows the answer. The question is usually for teaching purposes, for the benefit of the person being asked. Jesus doesn't make any assumptions, unlike people we know. Jesus is inviting Bartimaeus to decide for himself what he wants. Of course, Bartimaeus wants to see. I wonder if this is also a parable about spiritual blindness. Today's healing addresses physical blindness. Metaphorically, today's healing also speaks to us about spiritual blindness. We can see it in the Pharisees. They were spiritually blind, unable to recognize the Messiah, even as he stood before them in their midst. Have you ever had the experience of having a friend who is totally oblivious to what is happening around them? You can see clearly what the issue is, but your friend does not. How do they miss it? Do you have friends who end up repeating the same mistake over and over again because they cannot or will not see the obvious? Often the truth is too anxiety-evoking for the person, and unconsciously they choose not to deal with it. Have you ever had the experience of getting an insight into a situation and realizing the answer was in front of you all the time? What do you think is happening? I'd like to introduce you to the concept of defense mechanisms. as they can allow us to remain spiritually blind. The concept of defense mechanisms was first introduced by Sigmund Freud in 1894. Defense mechanisms are the first line of defense against anxiety, stress, or fear. Defense mechanisms work by distorting reality for a while. The person has time to focus and come up with a strategy to cope. Defense mechanisms by themselves are not bad initially, but because they lead us to distort reality, they can become problematic and dysfunctional after a while. 3 examples of defense mechanisms are regression, which is returning to an earlier development stage in response to stress. Adults may exhibit childlike behaviors when they feel overwhelmed, such as throwing a tantrum or reverting to comforting habits. Second, there is reaction formation, when we do the exact opposite of what we actually believe in order to prove to ourselves that we really don't believe in something negative or something that we're really embarrassed about. An example of this is when someone realizes they are racist, but do good things for the group in order to prove to themselves that they are not a racist. The third example is humor. With humor, people sometimes use sarcasm or teasing to hide the emotional impact of what they believe. We use these defense mechanisms to feel better about ourselves or to justify our actions. I wonder to what extent our defense mechanisms block us from painful truths in our lives. So, this healing of Bartimaeus is an opportunity for us to look at the spiritual blindness we may be carrying and which is preventing us from fully embracing a deep life-giving spirituality. Examples of spiritual blindness is having a very limited view of who God is for you. Can God surprise you? Do your expectations about how God can interact with you leave little room for recognizing God outside of those parameters? Many people are blinded about life. Expectations about life can lead us to take things for granted or miss the implications of what is happening in our life altogether. Rationalization can also be a defense mechanism if we have rationalized our actions as good when they're not. Even when confronted, many still remain blind rather than see the truth. Religion has a long history of being used to justify unjust and hurtful ideologies. Examples could be colonialism, slavery, unjust labor laws and practices, to name a few that Christians have supported. Collectively, we have rationalized some horrible behavior in our spiritual blindness. I want to come back to the question Jesus proposes to Bartimaeus. What do you want me to do for you? I invite you to ask yourself the same question. What do you want God to do for you? Do you want an easy life, free from pain or hurt? The problem is that when you don't deal with personal issues, you end up living a very superficial life. I'm not suggesting that one should seek out hardships, but rather pray for wisdom for the eyes of faith to see God's plan when we experience hardships. Is your faith based on meriting salvation? That's understandable, but there's so much more we can have. Also, keep in mind, we already have salvation. That is the good news. In conclusion, let us strive to be aware that we can be spiritually blind in different aspects of our life. Let us strive to be open to see what we're missing, to see what is plainly before us. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me next week when I examine the Gospel of Mark, who describes Jesus' teaching about the greatest commandment. If this is the first time you've heard my podcast and you are interested in hearing more, I urge you to listen to my podcast listed on the website. Every Sunday, I release a new podcast focusing on the gospel for the following week. I invite you to listen to all the podcasts, and I hope the reflections are useful to you. The podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture, is found on most platforms that carry podcasts. The podcast is also available on YouTube. Please do not hesitate to leave a review. Feedback from my listeners can be helpful in the development of the podcast. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my team, Heather Patel-Doherty and Richard Coulombe, who play an important part in the preparation of this podcast. If you have any questions or concerns, I can be reached by email at peter.doherty, O-M-I, that's D-O-H-E-R-T-Y, O-M-I, @gmail.com. God bless and have a great week.